and I decided to call it Kill the Union Before the Union Kills Us. And just so these are the points I want to cover. I want to just do an introduction to why we've got this topic now. I'm going to talk about the Anglo-British Union, why I'm using the term Anglo-British Union. Then a little bit about the history of the Union. Talk a little bit about Queen Anne, as it was her act of union. Then I want to link the whole thing to slavery. And then I want to link it to British nationalism and also to the idea of the working class. And the people who defend the Union say that the Union created the British working class, and therefore we must preserve the Union for that reason, because that's internationalism and it's and that's an argument we will meet somewhere down the track. Then I want to talk a little bit about Marx on Ireland, not because I really want to focus on Ireland, which I don't, but that Marx is a method is distinct and important. He's got some things that the way he thinks about the problem, which is very useful for us to how we should do it. And then we're talking about the end of the Union. I prefer the term, by the way. A lot of people talk about the breakup of the Union. You know, with Ireland becoming reunited, Scotland breaking away, maybe Wales. And so there's a popular term, the breakup of the Union. But I much prefer to think, I think Boris Johnson's breaking up the Union. And I think we want consciously to end it, you know, in a political sense. So I prefer to use the term end the Union or end of the Union. Anyway, that's just me being perhaps a bit finicky. Is that all right, comrades, then? I'll leave it up and then I'll take it down in a second, just if anybody wanted to note those down, so they'll know where I'm going. And so there's two reasons. Okay, there are two reasons why I decided to do this one this week, by the way. Three reasons. The number of reasons is getting bigger. One is because on the 28th of June, Nicola Sturgeon set a date for a fresh Scottish independence referendum, but to hold a consultative vote on in October 2023, next year. So there should be an event coming up in a year's time. And there's no time to get yourself ready than to think about it right now, not wait till the 22nd of October next year or whatever it is. So that's one reason. Secondly, the LLA is having a discussion on it on Thursday. And the person speaking is an old friend, comrade, and political enemy on this subject, Sandy McBurney. Sandy's a Scottish unionist. He would deny, he'd be offended if he said that, but he is. So that's why I'm calling him that, a Scottish unionist. So he's going to put a pro-unionist case. And then we have, in terms of winning people to republicanism, we have comrades like Tina, who's pretty good on republicanism, but doesn't get the union argument at all. Doesn't get the unionist argument. And I think that people like Tina, who are really allies of ours, we have to try to convince her somehow. So I don't see, first, I mean, just still in introduction, I don't see there's going to be any referendum on this issue. I think we'll probably be talking on Thursday about how we're going to vote in this referendum. But should we vote for it, or should we vote for it, or again, should we vote yes or no? But I almost think that's a kind of not reality. A more likely scenario, in my opinion, is that there will be some street demonstrations. There might be some mobilizations, and then some conflict in Scotland between unionists and nationalists. This is how it all began in Northern Ireland, something relatively peaceful, a peaceful protest for civil rights in 1969. And then before you know where you are, it starts to kick off. Then there are some attacks from the Paisley on the civil rights movement, and then the police are coming in, and then the whole thing goes in that direction. And of course, if you imagine at the same time a kind of rabid Tory unionist press starts to wind up hostility to Scottish nationalism, Scottish people, and that they begin to mobilize English nationalist ideas. So I think myself that that's a more likely thing we should be thinking about than this referendum. Could happen, don't get me wrong, but I think it's highly unlikely, and all the Tories are totally and utterly against it. They're not going to do what Cameron did again. So, and the next point I think is I'm still on introduction, is that we're in England, apart from Celia, right? Celia Celia have a view from a Scottish perspective that I hopefully we're not going to come, even though she's in Scotland, we're in England, we're not going to end up on a different page on this. The real thing is to get the English working class movement to take this question seriously and not think it's a Scottish question, which is why I mentioned Marx, by the way, on Ireland. And we'll come back to that. So what we are, as we are largely in England, we ought to be anti-unionist, regardless of what they're doing in Scotland, because I think it's in the interest of the English working class, in the interest of the Scottish working class, and in the interest of what you might call, for a better word, the general democratic development of the country, in other words, democratic progress, which is to the advantage of the working class, by the way. So, the more democracy there is, the more influence the working class is likely to have. So when we meet Sandy McBurney, he'll be associating internationalism. He'll say he'll be going on about against Scottish nationalism, putting on a kind of internationalist point of view. And I'll be wanting to say internationalism has got nothing to do with supporting the British Union, but rather extreme hostility to it. So it's the case really to say that the people of England should be hostile to the Union, as people in Scotland are. Well, how are they? It's about 50-50 split at the moment anyway. But I do believe that the task of ending the Union is now urgent, because in other discussions I said we're living in a crisis of democracy, where our political system is degenerating, and we have to be very, very careful. So that was a slogan, put it bluntly: kill the Union before the Union kills us, because we'd always like to have a peaceful settlement of a national question and not a sort of communal violence. We don't want a Yugoslav type situation happening here, and that seems highly unlikely, but it's not impossible, because the dark forces will be doing what they can to set people against each other, Tory dark forces. So hold on a second. So I was sending a letter to Nicola Sturgeon, say, dear Nicola, while you're messing about trying to call a referendum, the English working class has risen up, taken power, and declared the Union void and repealed. You know what I mean? So it's all done while you're thinking about it. That would be, of course, that ain't gonna happen, but that would be my fantasy idea, that the English took the control of the situation. That's it, it's repealed, end of. Now you can go away and do something else. Anyway, I wanted to refer to Lenin at this point. I'm still in introduction. I got a quote, which is one of my favorite quotes from Lenin. And it's from a pamphlet he wrote called Two Tactics. Shall I take this down a little bit? I might stop the screen sharing now. I assume everybody's seen that and see where we are. So can I take that, stop the share, and get me over, where am I? Yeah, get me over here somewhere. So Lenin has this quote, and to me it gets an essential idea of what a kind of revolutionary democratic approach is. Lenin says, it's more advantageous to the working class for the necessary changes in the direction of, he says, bourgeois democracy to take place by way of revolution and not by the way of reform. So if we're going to end the Union, it'd be better a revolution did it rather than reform. Simply, he says, because the way of reform is one of delay, procrastination, the painfully slow decomposition of the putrid parts of the national organism. It's the proletariat and the peasantry, he says, that suffer first of all and most of all from this putrefaction. So if our constitution degenerates and all the parts are rotten, and we can't sort it out, then the ordinary people is saying we'll suffer most from that. So it's the interests of ordinary people that we take a speedy direction and don't hang about. So he says the revolutionary path is one of rapid amputation, which is the least painful to the working class, the path of the immediate removal of what is putrescent, the path of the least compliance with and consideration for the monarchy and the abominable, vile, rotten, and noxious institutions that go with it. Now, of course, he's talked about Tsarist Russia, but I think the attitude is we wouldn't want to do. We want to reform the House of Lords and take 100 years to do it, right? And that institutions and getting in, because we've been trying to reform the House of Lords for about 100 years. We can't manage it. Tony Blair tried it. He only got halfway and all that. So it just carries on and on. The best way is to just go, well, that's it. It's close it down. You know what I mean? That if you've got the people to support that. So the answer would be end the union very quickly by mass action, and not let the whole thing drag on bit by bit, and the crisis get worse and the divisions in society get worse. Okay, so let's just talk about the Anglo-British Union. And you can call it the British Union. The Anglo-British Union was the Anglo-British Union was a state that was established during the British Revolution that took place, and I've talked about this bit before, between 1638, where the Bishops' War started in Scotland, started between Charles I and the Scottish Presbyterians, right the way up to 1707. And during this 70 years of democratic revolution and counter-revolution, that ended or stabilized a constitutional monarchy in which sovereignty or legal authority, if you like, was vested in the Crown in Parliament. This is the period that creates our modern constitution that we have today. And the Union is one of the fundamental parts of the constitution. It's so fundamental that it's referenced in the official title of the state as the Union Kingdom, or if you like, the United Kingdom. And it stands therefore as one of the basic political institutions, along with the monarchy, the Westminster Parliament, House of Lords and Commons, the Privy Council, the established Church of England, which, as we all know, is the Tory party at prayer. And if we want to understand the Tories, they're not simply a conservative party like the German Christian Democrats or the US Republicans. The Tories are based on three key pillars. They are the monarchy, the Union, and the established Church of England. And if you think about the Labour Party is a bit like that, because it's also the Labour Party replaced the Liberals, the Whigs and the Liberals, the two-party system, equally committed to the monarchy, equally committed to the Union, but much more non-conformist in religious toleration, in religious attitudes. The Welsh Methodists, the Quakers, Scottish Catholics, they're all more likely to be voting for the Labour Party historically. So the history of the formation of the Union, therefore, in the 17th century, it happened in this whole period of 70 years. We had an English Parliament until 1707, it was abolished. We had a Scottish Parliament until 1707, it was abolished. We had an Irish Parliament from 1537 right the way up to 1801, it was abolished. So the real point of the Union is the abolition of the Irish, Scottish, and I would also argue, strictly speaking, the English Parliament, all replaced by the British Union at Westminster. And it's a kind of bureaucratic centralism. It means that what's happening is the country's being, these different nations, Wales don't get a look in this because Wales is kind of incorporated into England at this time, the three kingdoms. These different nations are therefore put under one law and hence one market. I call it the Anglo-British Union because it really is, as soon as you study the history of it, it is the expansion of England. It is the domination of England in a political and constitutional domination of England over Ireland, Scotland and Wales. And I made this point before, that's why the Parliament of this union is in London. It's not in Dublin, it's not in Edinburgh, it's not in Cardiff. I mean, even you say that, it sounds ridiculous that it could be. So because London is the capital of the Union and hence of the empire. So this period of time formed the Union as a fundamental part. And if you look at the battles that the New Model Army took during the English Revolution, when they went to Ireland, when they went to Scotland, when Cromwell went there and suppressed the opposition in Scotland and crushed the Irish at Drogheda and those sort of infamous things that happened there. And then the whole thing's repeated in the Glorious Revolution, when the Williamite army defeats the Jacobites, goes to Ireland. You have the famous Battle of the Boyne, which we know the Orangemen, William's Orangemen defeat the Jacobite armies. The William armies go to Scotland, they defeat the Jacobites in Scotland. So all these times, force is being used, and Scotland and Ireland are being brought under the control of England. I would use the word oppression. I believe that we have the constitutional oppression and subordination of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales to England, and its incorporation by the British ruling class. Now, you've got to be careful when you use the word oppression. Oppression doesn't mean necessarily violence. So you've got to be careful. It just means domination. If we think of women's oppression could be more cultural and ideologically, not necessarily about violence. But violence sometimes comes in then as a decisive factor. If the oppressed people start, as it were, women, slaves, nations, whatever, start to rebel, then violence comes in. But often oppressive relations aren't directly violent at some point. And clearly the relation between England and Scotland is not a violent one, although the one between England and Ireland was very violent for a long time, and even in living memory. So the Act of Union is a fundamental part of the state, along with the constitutional monarchy. The actual Act of Union between England and Scotland is Queen Anne's. It was carried out by Queen Anne, who was the next queen after William and Mary, 1707. And it was designed to do certain things. One, it was designed to secure the Protestant succession, to make sure that Scotland would not bring a Catholic back in, and that what England had a Hanoverian to be the next successor. So Queen Anne was very keen to make sure that the Protestant succession was secured. Make sure that Scotland couldn't be used as a base for the arch enemy of France. The union would last forever, because the actual Act of Union says you'll never get out of this. It's permanent. It lasts forever. It actually says that. There's no self-determination. You can't leave. There's no escape. You've not, and the abolition of the Scottish Parliament, as I said, to ensure that it never became a rival power. Now, the Scottish MPs, many Scottish MPs supported the Act of Union because they were bribed. Not because, and not only that, because the English had moved an army up to the Scottish border just to remind them, if you don't accept these bribes, and Scotland was bankrupt at that time because of this, what's called the Darien catastrophe. This imperial Scottish tried to set up their own little empire, and it went badly wrong. It cost them a small fortune. And so for these Scottish MPs, Scottish lairds or whatever, they saw that the union with England would be advantageous to them. And so ordinary Scots didn't support it. There were riots in Edinburgh against it. But of course, they didn't have a vote in those days. So rioting was the only way that you could oppose it. So I'd simply argue it wasn't democratic in any sense. It was imposed by threats of violence and bribery. I think one of the most important things to say about and I just ordered a book by Kate Phillips called Scotland, Jamaica and Slavery. And if I was going to talk about the union between England and Scotland, I'd say it's the treaty that launched 1,000 ships. Remember, I think that was Helena Troy, was the face that launched 1,000 ships. Do you remember that one? Helena Troy. Well, this was the treaty that launched 1,000 ships. And because in her book, she shows how much of Scotland's economic development for 150 years after the Act of Union was made out of the Caribbean slave trade and the very complicated system of loans and finance and insurance. So the treaty that launched 1,000 ships was the treaty that launched the slave trade. Slave trade was already going on before, by the way, in the 17th century. It just expanded because it now became the British slave trade and the British and part of the British colonial empire. So there were about 6 million African slaves shipped out of Africa. But between 1660 and 1807, 3 million people were carried in British ships, the peak year being 1780. So in a way, in this sense, the Act of Union is dripping in blood, kidnapping, terror, murder, torture, and rape. I personally would take this treaty down to Bristol and I would throw it in the Bristol Channel in the same place where they dumped the statue of Edward Colston. So that's how much I don't like it. I think you're going to get the idea if you think of it. But it hasn't been connected to that, but it really is part of that whole picture. Britain never existed. There wasn't any British identity. So when the Act of Union came in, there was a new nationalism that followed from the Act of Union. It wasn't a democratic nationalism. It wasn't a people's nationalism coming from below, from the people's struggles. It came from above. It came actually from outside because it was forged by war. And it was the first, and the British then engaged in the first modern World War. World War I, actually, strictly speaking, was between Britain and France, fought out in America, Canada, the Caribbean, and India. Being British did not mean being working class, of course. It meant you were not French. You didn't like the French. Sorry, Marie. Sorry about that. And it was a contrast between the superiority of the British nation, because we were Protestant, that we had a fine navy. We were not Catholic that was another good reason. And we were not absolutists like the French. They were just, they had an absolute ruler, so that was terrible as well. We were fine, free people with our big navy and loads of slaves. And of course, Britain fought then, and that was the whole expansion of Britain. So Linda Colley, who's a historian of the 18th century, this was how it was with the British after 1707, she says. They came to define themselves as a single people, not because of any political or cultural consensus at home, but rather in reaction to the other beyond our shores, and the other being mainly the French. So we can't see British nationalism as anything progressive from the beginning. And Sandy will probably start telling us on Thursday about the union and the working class. You know, the union was great because it created the British working class, is maybe how he will pitch the story. But the point is that the Anglo-British Union created the British working class, not the other way around. It was not the British working class that created the union. It was not a working class union. It was not a union forged by the working class. The union created the working class in the same way that capitalism creates the working class by employing people. It created a working class not as a collective democratic class, but as a class of wage slaves, atomized workers, etc. So I don't see anything in that sense progressive about the Act of Union. It created a bigger imperial capitalism and gave us a British identity, a British cultural values, imperialistic, chauvinistic values that we still have to this day. Next point, let's look at the time. I'm going to stop in a minute, Conrad, so let's give myself a little bit more. I mean, I've got to the end. I looked at Marx and Ireland, and what is important, and I've got a lot of quotes from Marx, but I won't bother with them all because they take on too much. But what's really important about Marx, for me, is this, that Marx, when Marx is talking about Ireland and the way that unionism has suppressed the Irish, he doesn't just talk about Ireland, he talks about England. So for Marx, this is about the interaction between the English and the Irish. It's the two sides of the same thing. Right, and he sees them being mutually reinforcing. He has that point, you know, if England suppresses Ireland, it can never be free itself. You know, if England can break free of this union with Ireland itself, England will become. So in a sense, it's not about just the Irish fighting for their freedom, which of course they're going to do anyway. It's also about getting the support of the English working class to understand that they don't have an interest in the supporting the union. And of course, right into Chartism, there's a whole strain of anti-unionism in the Chartist movement with Fergus O'Connor and so on and so forth. So the point is, you have to think, not just start talking about Scotland as if like Scotland, it's an English question. It's not just a Scottish question. That's the essential idea. And I'll skip over that. I'm just going to take my notes down and move on a little bit. Hang on a second. A lot more quotes on that. I'm now coming to Marx said, okay, in the end, Marx advocated the separation of Ireland from England. He says, although after separation, there may come federation. And that's always been my position. First independence, then if we do that as speedily as possible, it's sort of with the haste that Lenin wanted us to go, like instantly without messing about. The quicker we did it, don't let it degenerate, don't let procrastination. The quicker it's done, the more radical it's done, and the much more likely that you will get good relations between the English and the Scottish. And you may then end up with a federal state voluntarily entered into by the English and the Scots and maybe the Welsh and maybe the Irish even as well. That's all. It seems more possible. On the other hand, if you have this slow degeneration, this slow, painful thing that Lenin talked about, everything will get worse and relations will degenerate. So that is why speed is important, I would argue. I'm now going to come on. The modern union is dissolving. So just as the British Empire's gone and we've come back to Britain, we're going in reverse now. And you can see that's happening, that the active union remained in place until 1997, because as soon as Tony Blair gave a Scottish and Welsh parliaments, he had knocked out one of the key features of the active union, which was the abolition of the Scottish Parliament. And Blair even says he made a mistake there, because as soon as you got a Scottish Parliament, the Scots will start doing all sorts of different things and doing things they're not meant to be doing with their different kind of democracy. You know, that's the danger of it all. If you give them a bit of democratic reform, what's going to happen next, kind of thing. So Blair, you know, the rebellious Scots are starting to make mischief, sort of idea, and that's what Blair thinks. He did it because he had to do it, by the way, but he really regrets it. He thinks it's terrible. And then Cameron hit another blow to the union when he gave Scotland a referendum, because the referendum implied that Scotland could leave the union, but the active union says they cannot. Cameron only did it because he thought he could win, and of course he did win in the end. He wouldn't have done it if he thought that the nationalists would do that. But again, these are two holes, if you like, blown in the original active union. And you can now see, by the way, that since 2008, since this terrible degeneration that we've gone through since the austerity program that's gone through, Northern Irish politics is basically on the unionist versus nationalist dynamic. And what's happened in Scotland in the last few years is now we've got the unionist nationalist dynamic being the same fundamental flaw in Scotland. On the unionist side, you've got the Labour Party, the Tories and the Liberals. And on the nationalist side, you've got the SNP, the Greens, and certain sections of the left that support them as well. The left, you know. That looks quite different, because in England, our politics is traditionally Whigs versus Tories, or Conservative versus Labour. That's the old model that everybody knew, but it's not the model that's now in Scotland. But I think we should see that after Brexit, that model's also breaking down, and that Boris Johnson can be seen as an English nationalist, and Jeremy Corbyn could be seen as an English Republican. But it's a bit hard to see him like that. But he did follow Tony Benn. You could think, I'll end on this point, you could think that Boris Johnson was the heir of Enoch Powell, who was a very strongly an English nationalist with all his attitudes. And Jeremy Corbyn is the heir of Tony Benn. So we haven't had that change happening yet, but we are getting to that point where I do think the two-party system in England is also under pressure from that. And Paul's going to ask me a question, and I'm going to stop at that point.